Good afternoon and welcome to the Shine Expert webinar series. We're delighted to introduce webinar number 5 in the series with the theme Mental Illness and Young People, Stigma, Discrimination and Seeking Support. So welcome to the teachers and local authority staff who've joined us this afternoon. We appreciate that you might have had a full day already in front of the screen with remote teaching. So we're delighted that you've taken this opportunity to join us for the webinar this afternoon. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from our guest presenters today. That's Professor Simon Hunter, Rebecca Johnson, Rachel Taylor and Sofia Pimenta. Professor Hunter is based at Glasgow Caledonian University, where he leads the Child and Adolescent Health Research Group. And his research into mental health and developmental psychology focuses on understanding the psychological and social well-being of children and young people. As the associate editor of Stigma and Health in the International Journal of Bullying Prevention, Professor Hunter's research interests include violence reduction, loneliness, and mental illness stigma. Rebecca, Rachel and Sofia, who will be presenting alongside Professor Hunter, are at various stages of their PhD studies, so we're looking forward to hearing from them. And their studies are supervised by Professor Hunter, and they share his interests in mental health stigma and discrimination. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Without further ado, obviously you've shared your slides already, so just a reminder to everyone, there'll be a 20-minute presentation first, and then the opportunity to ask some questions and interact directly with our presenters via the Q&A chat box, so you can type in questions at any point. Okay, so delighted to hand over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Dawn, that was great. I was expecting to introduce us all, but you've already introduced us all, so that's perfect. Really what I'm going to do today, or what we're going to do today, is talk to you a little bit about mental illness amongst young people and about their experiences of stigma, discrimination and seeking support. As Dawn said, I'm supervising the PhDs of Rebecca and Sofia and Rachel, and they're at different stages in their PhDs, so Rebecca and Rachel are right near the beginning of their PhDs, and Sophia's further on, she's writing up now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about mental illness, stigma and discrimination, and essentially about what we mean when we're talking about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's relevant in a school context, so you can perhaps understand why it makes sense to talk about it. Then I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, and she'll talk about developing a measure of mental illness, stigma and or discrimination, and why that might be useful for you in schools and for other people dealing with children, young people. Then Rachel's going to tell us a bit about mental illness, stigma in the context of bullying and how it might operate there. And Sophia's going to tell us about her work looking at young people, how they respond to their own symptoms of mental illness, and importantly, I think, how they respond to disclosures of the same symptoms from their friends, given that we encourage them to talk to their friends and to talk to someone about these kind of problems. Then we'll finish, of course, with the discussion, and I hope that you'll feel free to share your thoughts with us as well. And we're really looking forward to learning from you as well as sharing a bit about what we know. So what do we actually mean then by mental illness, stigma or discrimination? Well, when we're talking about mental illness, stigma, we're usually talking about a stigma that's a way of devaluing and presenting people who have got mental illness as usually as abnormal or as undesirable in some way. And when we discuss stigma, we're often talking about it in two key ways. The first of those is public stigma. Public stigma really can be thought of as the kind of stereotypical attitudes that lots of people have about mental illness. We also often talk about self-stigma, and self-stigma is where a young person believes and internalizes that public stigma, so where they take the kind of well-known attitudes about a particular group, but they believe them to be true for themselves. And then kind of slightly separate to that, we've also got discrimination, and that's essentially the behaviours that are based on stigmatising beliefs or attitudes. So you can see here some examples of how we might think about those three different areas. It might be that a public attitude about people with mental illness is that they're weird, or perhaps that they're dangerous. Those might lead to particular discriminatory behaviours. So, for example, peers might exclude other young people who have got a mental illness because they see them as weird or because they see them as dangerous. And a self-stigma might be that where people come to believe those things to be true about themselves. So someone who's experiencing mental illness might begin to see themselves as weird, or might start to believe and worry that they themselves are dangerous. And in a school context, this particularly comes to the fore in terms of public stigmas about the capabilities of people with mental illnesses, particularly, for example, that perhaps they can't do well at school or they're not going to do well in their career later on. And that might lead to teachers or other staff to expect less of those young people. And even if they're not expecting less, there's also the issue that the young person themselves might believe that they can't achieve what they would like to achieve because they've got a mental illness, and they might not think they can do well in school or beyond that. In a school context, again, it's kind of coming back to why it's important. We know that a lot of young people experience mental illness or symptoms of mental illness. Almost 15% of teenagers are going to experience a diagnosed mental illness during their teen years. Another third will experience clinically relevant symptoms. So they'll experience symptoms of mental illness, even though they never quite reach the stage where they've got a diagnosis. We know that mental illness stigma in its different forms for children and young people is associated with feelings of shame, of fear, or with social rejection, and that's particularly true in the family, with lower self-esteem, with less help seeking, and these are different themes that we'll be picking up on as we go through our talk today. So now I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, and she's just going to tell you a bit about why it might actually be important to assess young people's experiences of mental illness, stigma and discrimination.
Hello, thank you, Simon. So yeah, I'm Rebecca Johnson. I am a first year PhD student at GCU, so right at the beginning. And my work is mainly focused around the experience of mental illness, stigma and discrimination that young people have, which surprisingly is an under-researched area in the mental illness stigma research landscape. And I'm really hoping to try and tackle this in a variety of different ways. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work and why it's needed. Next slide. I'm just going to, I don't know if I should do a movement or if we'll figure it out. So just to lead on a little bit from what Simon's already introduced, we've looked at outcomes of mental illness stigma for young people. And I think it's really important to actually look at how young people describe these outcomes and how they feel it impacts them. So a really interesting report, which I've included in recommended reading, is from YMCA in 2016. And some of these are really interesting because young people specifically highlighted that mental illness stigma is impacting their confidence and self-esteem most, which, you know, is really concerning, but especially for teachers and educators, this can impact how young people engage in class, how they academically achieve, and just their confidence all round and lifestyle resilience. Mental illness stigma can also stop young people from help seeking, which we've seen, that 70% of young people said it made them less likely to speak, and 56% said it made them less likely to seek professional help. But the one that really kind of shocked me was that 74% of young people said that this stigma that they were experiencing made them unwilling to go out. Like, I find that quite a dramatic statistic. I think that's quite harrowing to hear that young people in this number are really being impeded in living their everyday life by mental illness stigma. And another interesting statistic is that 78% of young people between the ages of 15 to 25 would feel really comfortable speaking about a physical illness or a physical attribute that they're dealing with, but only 37% would do this if it was their mental illness. So clearly what these statistics tell us is that children and young people are experiencing stigma in relation to mental illness or mental ill health. So what do we know and what can we do? So yeah, what we know. So stigma is a large barrier to children and young people in many ways. This is obvious. You know, the research is telling us this, the literature is telling us this, young people are telling us this. A really great report by See Me Scotland from their Feels FM campaign in 2019 showed that the largest barrier for young people talking about mental health is fear. So fear of not being listened to, fear of not being heard or taken seriously. And that's a relation to stigma. So that's really concerning. Sorry, my laptop keeps opening up another document. Okay. And what else we know is that schools across Scotland are taking steps to reduce this. So there's some really great approaches going on, whether these are local authority approaches, single school approaches, to create a positive mental health culture and atmosphere so that young people do feel they can overcome this stigma. So this is what we know, and this is what's going on. But what we don't know is how children and young people actually experience stigma and discrimination, because it's a really adult focused research area. Most research has been done on theories of stigma and discrimination from adult perspective, how to measure adult experiences, and really very little has actually been done to understand, how do young people understand stigma? Is it the same? Do they view it the same way we do? Do they associate the same things with mental illness stigma that we do? We don't really know. And because of this, we don't really know how to measure it. So at the minute, a lot of anti-stigma work that's being done is being measured by measuring things like help seeking. Does this improve? Or, you know, some other indirect measures. But at the minute, there's no one valid measure of children and young people's experience of mental illness, stigma, and discrimination. So what this does is that it somewhat undermines anti-stigma work or stigma reduction work, because if you're doing all this great work to change stigma and discrimination for young people, but you can't really benchmark that and you can't really track the trajectory of this change, it's quite difficult to monitor that or see what progress you're making. And also in terms of theory, our theoretical understanding is really limited without understanding how children and young people experience mental illness, stigma, and discrimination. We need the unique perspective of children and young people to really broaden our understanding and give us a deeper knowledge of mental illness, stigma, and how it affects children. So I'm hoping to tackle this, or hoping to start to tackle this. It's a PhD, it's 3 years. I can't fix it all. I'm going to do my best. So I've got two main objectives of how I want to do this. So firstly, I want to include young people in my research meaningfully and by using participatory research methods. And basically all this means is that I want children and young people to guide my research. I want them to be involved in every stage. I want them to be co-researchers. So I want them to work alongside me, making decisions on the project, analyzing data with me, collecting data with me, really just involving them in any way I can, because I want young people's lived experience and voice to be at the center of this research and this measure that I'm hoping to create, which is point 2. I would really, my whole goal of this project, my main objective, is to create this valid measure. So this is going to involve both qualitative and quantitative work. So in-depth interviews, really trying to get deep with young people to understand, how do you experience this and how can I best capture that? And then some quantitative work, which will involve large scale measure validation. So obviously designing a measure, testing it hopefully in schools, which would be really beneficial to test it on a wide array of young people. So I can really understand, is it fit for purpose? Have I designed something right? And give me feedback and let me make sure it's the best it can be. And hopefully this can be a reliable benchmark for schools. So it can inform how we, take forward policy and practice. It can inform how we tackle and reduce stigma and discrimination, and can be used to really track that anti-stigma reduction work that you're doing. And that's the eventual aim. So yeah, that's roughly some of the work I'm hoping to do and why it's important. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this and how best you think this can be utilized in schools. So thank you. I don't know if I'm passing back to Simon or passing directly on. What should we do?
I'll come straight in. Why not?
Yeah, go Ray.
So I'm Rachel Taylor. I'm also a first year PhD student. So I've only been doing this a couple of months, but really enjoying it so far. And I'm looking at understanding the relationship between self-stigma and school bullying. I'm based at the University of Strathclyde. Simon's obviously my supervisor along with some others, and I'm funded by the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science and also the Mental Health Foundation. Thank you, Simon. So Simon's already kind of introduced everyone to the concept of self-stigma, but just to kind of reiterate that, self-stigma is basically where young people hear about all these things that are out in the public domain, all these negative opinions that other people might have about mental illness. And if they themselves have that mental illness, they can internalize those opinions and start to believe them about themselves. So we've got some examples here, as you can see. So young people might think just that they're weird, they're dangerous, that they can't do well in school. And that can actually have a knock-on effect, which we haven't discussed yet. And that's called the why try effect. The why try effect is very aptly named. It's basically just the effect that young people might believe, well, why should I try? This is an effect that's already been found to apply to adults that are high in self-stigma. They start to believe, you know, I'm not worthy, I'm not able, I'm not capable of doing things that other people are capable of doing because of my mental illness. And this then leads to an outcome of having reduced self-worth. They think that they're not worthy of doing things because they're not able, and also reduced help seeking. There isn't anything in the research right now examining this effect in young people. So it's really important that we look at this and see whether this is the case with young people as well. And ultimately, what might this mean for young people that are bullied? Well, initially, I think it's important to look at, well, who might be at risk of this? Is it just young people with mental illness, or is it just people that are bullied? Well, Nodde et al. In 2020 found that there's a significant association between people being bullied and experiencing mental health difficulties in young people. So it's likely to be those same people that are being bullied that are also experiencing difficulties with their mental health. These individuals might, experience high levels of self-stigma, and thus they might experience the associated outcomes. If they were to experience the why try effect, which we know appears in adults, then they might avoid seeking treatment for their mental health. They might avoid seeking help from their teachers or their parents for bullying, and they're very likely to experience feelings of hopelessness and low self-worth. So when I'm looking at my study, which is understanding the relationship between these two things, right now it seems that the literature is suggesting that these young people might experience worse mental health and also more persistent experiences of bullying. So, I mean, what can we actually do about this? Well, I've thought of a few action points that I'm hoping to complete throughout my PhD, which will hopefully have some more positive outcomes. So first of all, similar to what Rebecca was saying, I'm hoping to use a participatory research method, and that just means using young people as co-researchers to ensure that their voices are heard throughout all aspects of the research project. I'm hoping that will allow young people to feel empowered, and it will give them the skills and the language that they need to advocate for their needs. I'm hoping that the studies that I conduct, I'm hoping to conduct 2 studies, that they will ensure that self-stigma and bullying is explored in a young population. That's something that has never really been done in the literature before, and we need to understand what the outcome of that might look like. So hopefully that we can add to the literature, and then that will then lead on to my final point, which is to use the co-researchers to produce meaningful and evidence-based resources. So I'm hoping to produce resources that are aimed at reducing stigma and also encouraging help seeking, and that they will then go back into community and school settings and can hopefully alleviate some of the potential negative outcomes of self-stigma in those that are bullied. So that's kind of an overview of what my topic is. I hope that it was very clear. Let me know if you've got any questions, any feedback. Something I'd really like to know is whether you think that this is a problem in young people, and what kind of resources you would find helpful to use in schools. Thank you, Simon. Pass on to Sophia.
Yes, thank you. So as it was said, by Simon. My name is Sofia. I'm a final year PhD student, and I'm in a little bit of different stages. Rachel and Rebecca are, so I'm the final stage. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting a little bit of the results from my research. So my research focused on how young people actually seek help or support for their mental illness. And as Simon said, and I'm trying to see the differences between how they deal with their own symptoms or a friend's symptoms. So I divided my PhD between 3 different studies. So the first study was more about an interview-based study. If you can just change slide. Thank you. So an interview-based study that I just wanted to generally try to understand young people's perceptions about how they deal with their own symptoms and how they would deal with the friend's symptoms of poor mental health. So I interviewed 11 young people between the ages of 12 and 15. And basically the image that you see there in the slide, it's just a visual representation of all the themes that came out of the interviews. And mainly young people just said that they were very concerned about the social impact that having a mental health issue could have. And also they were concerned about the resources they could choose and also how different factors could influence their choices. So for example, among different results, there seems to be a difference in terms of how young people deal with their own symptoms and how they deal with their friends. So for example, mostly young people fear judgment from others and feel that they might feel embarrassed to tell others about their symptoms when they are dealing with their own symptoms, and not so much when they're talking with a friend about a friend's symptoms. When it comes, for example, to trust, young people seem to describe a different way of considering trust as an important resource. So for example, participants would say that they would reveal their own symptoms to someone that they feel like they can trust. But on the other hand, they would feel like they would be breaking a friend's trust if they would reveal their disclosure of symptoms to, for example, a trusted adult. So in this particular case, if they would feel like their friend would need help from a teacher, even if they felt like it was something that would be beneficial, most likely they will not ask for their teacher's help, which is a little bit concerning. When it comes, for example, in asking for help, generally young people do not see a school staff as a helpful resource or someone that they can actually disclose this type of information to when they are dealing with their own symptoms, especially because they say that they would like to keep both their personal and their school life separate and not mix the two of them, which is also a little bit concerning, and we need to try to understand why this is the case. And finally, when it comes to choices of resource, there appears to be a lack of knowledge about not only the availability of professional resources, but also when is the right time to ask for help, or when could be a right time. Because most of the times young people said that they only would ask for help from a professional if they think the symptoms are severe, and for them a severe symptom is mostly a self-harming behavior or even a suicide attempt or thoughts. So these are some concerning results that we're getting from this particular interview. So my next 2 studies were quant studies that were designed based on these results, and both of them just focused on trying to understand then the effect of stigma, trust, and the threat that they felt from experiencing these symptoms on their help-seeking behaviors. And I basically focused on 5 types of support that they could have from friends, parents, teachers, professionals, and online. And basically the results just showed that when young people are dealing with their own symptoms, higher levels of both self-stigma and public stigma increases their feelings of threat and that something bad could come from experiencing symptoms of poor mental health. On the other hand, in both situations, self and friend, high trust levels in the 5 different sources of support actually led to a higher likelihood of asking for help from those sources. So in this case, if they felt like they can trust their teachers, they were more likely to ask them for help in these 2 different scenarios, which is actually encouraging. When we are looking specifically for the friend section, in the results, we see that higher levels of only self-stigma increase threats and increase those threat feelings, and not both self and public stigma like in the self symptoms. We also see that higher public stigma resulted in a lower support seeking and seeking support from parents, friends, and professionals, which in this case means that stigma seems to not actually be playing within this particular study, playing a role when they are seeking support from teachers and online, which is also important to try to explore why this is the case. And finally, again, trust seems to be also important when seeking help for a friend. So finally, in terms of just the take-home message that I would like you guys to have, and although there's much more and much others like variables and factors that could play into this type of relationships, overall, it seems that there is some differences and some similarities when they are dealing with their own or a friend's symptoms. And this is important because, as Simon said, we encourage young people to disclose their symptoms, and they are most likely going to disclose symptoms to a friend because they do spend a lot of time with their friends and they do trust their friends. So trying to understand how a young person deals with a friend's disclosure is important so that we can also provide a little bit more support and try to provide specific support for that situation. Generally, also young people don't see teachers and school staff as helpful resources, and it's good to try to understand why this is the case and why do they say that they need to create almost a separation from house and school settings. And then linked to this particular situation and these particular results that I got from my interviews, building trust and creating a space in relationships where young people feel confident and feel safe with sharing their own or even a friend's symptom seems to be one of the key elements that we might try to work on and try to build with our young people. And finally, just only honing in on what stigma and what we've been talking about until now, just that stigma seems to affect young people help-seeking behaviors in different ways, and that different types of stigma seem to have different type of outcomes. We saw that, for example, both types of stigma makes young people feel more threatened when they are dealing with their own, but in the case of only dealing with the friends, self-stigma seems to be particularly helpful, for example, when they are seeking help from a friend. So it would be important to further understand the role of different types of stigma in help-seeking behaviors, like the work that Rachel and Rebecca are doing, so that we can also provide more support and that you as educators also can have a little bit more of understanding of what you could be doing to provide a little bit more of a support and being helpful to young people. So this is basically what I've had to say. So I'll hand it back to Simon so that we can have a closing arguments. Thank you all.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks to everyone who's contributed today. And as I said at the start, we really are looking to get feedback from you and to know what your thoughts are on these areas. It's very much a new and interesting area to look at. There's actually not much research and developmental research in terms of children and young people's experiences of stigma and discrimination at all. So, we're particularly interested to learn more about what your opinions are about what might contribute towards improving young people's help-seeking behaviours. What do you think might need to change or improve so that young people trust teachers and school staff more in terms of discussing or disclosing mental illness? What steps have you been taking to reduce stigma or improve help seeking from young people? It'd be really interesting to hear from you in those regards. And as Rachel and Rebecca said, what might be helpful in terms of anti-stigma work or help seeking resources? What do you think you would actually be able to use or would be helpful for you? So I'll pass you back to Dawn. And we'll be happy to take questions and to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much to all of you. That was really interesting to hear all the different perspectives there and how everything really plays a part on the pupil's perspective of their self. So we have one question that came in advance, which I'd like to start with, and then if our guests on the call would like to type into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions that you would like to put, or I can unmute you as well if you'd like to ask the question verbally. But first of all, a question that came in from Catherine Graham earlier in the week, who'd like to find out more about discrepancies between how boys and girls see themselves and seek or don't seek support. She's found often seems to be the case that girls worry more about academic achievement, body image and relationships, and that they're worrying about these things more than boys, and they tend to seek support more often. And so the question is it that boys have more self-efficacy and resilience, or is it more a question of they don't have the confidence or the wherewithal to seek support? It's quite a detailed question. Who would like to pick up on that?
I think Sophia might be able to tell us a little bit about this in terms of her actual results and the data that she's collected.
Yeah, my specific data do not look at how boys or girls in terms of efficacy, or for example, what type of problems they actually search help for. But the things that I've looked at, what I've come across was that girls would be less likely to ask for help from professionals, teachers, and online sources of support. So that would be more where my study is going to. But the question itself sometimes just in some places already answers a little bit, or where the literature sometimes goes, saying that sometimes girls are a little bit more prone to be seeking for a little bit more of an emotional support. And this kind of supports a little bit of what I'm finding, which is girls actually seek more help from friends within my own research. And this, but then in terms of what I'm finding, I would need to have a little bit more detail in terms of why this is the case, and if it's just because of self-efficacy or not, or if it's because of other issues. There are, for example, cultural issues that girls are told that it's fine to be emotional, and boys sometimes are told that they need to be strong. So those type of differences are also sometimes at play, and it's hard to sometimes explore every single thing within a research. So that's a little bit where I'm at. But I think Simon, within his field of research in bullying, also has some theories, and I think he could add something.
Yeah, I mean, gender differences is the kind of perennial question, and that comes up everywhere. And I think certainly for self-efficacy, it's true that I think boys and girls have different strengths in terms of what they feel they've got efficacy in changing and working towards. And it can work on the flip side, and that's what kind of Sophia is alluding to in terms of young people themselves, I think, recognise that. And there's, for example, work in bullying that suggests that they know that the best things to attack or undermine in their own particular group are things that are important to, for example, girls, or examples, or important to boys. So girls tend to attack social standing more than boys might, and boys might, certainly when they're younger, and focus more on physical strength. But
Okay, thank you. Certainly interesting from some of the discussions I've had with young people as well, that we had this difference in opinion from a group of boys and girls, where the girls said that they were much happier to sort of talk about their feelings, whereas the boys said that if they were going to discuss them, it certainly wouldn't be with friends, it was more likely to be with an adult, which was interesting, and that they were more likely to seek help from a teacher than go to a friend, where the stereotype was that you wouldn't show that you were having problems. So different approaches, and gender definitely plays a part. So we've got some questions coming in just now in the Q&A box, so I will just have a look at those. So the question here, do young people understand the term stigma, and do we know if this concept is meaningful for them? That's a great question, I think.
But I'm going to hand over to both Rebecca and Rachel, because we've been having lots of discussions about this very issue. So Rebecca, you're unmuted. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so I think this is the main thing I'm currently grappling with in the initial stages of my PhD, is that all of the literature that I can find on mental illness stigma is theoretical models and, you know, the perspective of experience of adults. And there's very, very little work done on how do young people actually describe and understand stigma. So I also work at CME Scotland as well, the National Anti-Stigma and Discrimination Programme. And a lot of the work I've done with young people there is that they do understand stigma. They do know the concept. Whether they actually will use the terminology stigma and discrimination is yet to be defined. But sometimes if you explain the experience and explain the definition, they'll go, oh yeah, I've definitely had that. Oh yeah, I've definitely experienced that. And I think that's currently what my initial qualitative work is going to focus on, in that, do we need to ensure that there's adequate explanation so young people can really get their experience out there? How are they defining it? And what are the really important factors of stigma? For example, as we've referenced, girls will maybe focus on peer relationships, and young people in general place a really high importance on peer relationships. So I'm going to be mainly looking at that and trying to dig that out a bit more. But yeah, that's a great question, which hopefully I'll have answers to at some point.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Rachel?
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that a little bit, just in terms more specifically to self-stigma. So in the very limited literature that actually exists about kind of stigma experienced by young people, something that tends to come up a lot is that young people won't necessarily use the term stigma or self-stigma, but young people with mental illness will often say things like, I think I'm different, but not in a good way, or I think I'm weird, or these kind of concepts. So they're not using the word self-stigma. They're not saying there's public stigma and I've internalized that. That's not how they will word it. But they're recognizing that there's something different about them and others don't view that in a good way. And that's something that comes out quite a lot. To add to that, when we're working with young people, you don't always have to use the term stigma, and that's not necessarily how I'll approach it. And we often use things like, vignettes and things. So we will give young people an example, say, have you ever felt, Sharon feels different. She often gets a bit nervous when she's in social situations. So people tend to leave her out and she feels sad about this. Have you ever felt like that? Or have you seen other people feel like that? And that's a way that you can approach stigma or concepts of stigma with young people without using the term as such. But yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It's certainly something that both Rebecca and I are considering at the moment.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Geneva Ohan has had PhD students who've looked at stigma amongst young people who have got either a mental illness or who are attracted to same-sex partners. And she said that their work, they both found that when you tried to explain what stigma was to them, they just thought that was wild. Why would you hate yourself or think bad things about yourself in that way? But then when they got examples about these kind of thoughts or beliefs, then they're like, oh yeah, actually I do think like that and I do that. So I guess it's sometimes about explaining it in different ways for them.
Yeah, so the power of example is an excellent one. Okay, and the second thing here in the Q&A box is actually a comment rather than a question, which says, really thought-provoking presentations. Thank you to you all. There needs to be a shift in school cultures towards a more nurturing approach towards children and young people, especially in secondary settings. Key focus should be health and well-being and positive relationships, and then schools will see improved attainment and achievement over time. And that's from Alan Brown at Fife Council, just sharing that. So any sort of thoughts on that in terms of your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with Alan. I think it's a really good comment. I think that the challenge is how we go about doing that and how we see that shift towards that nurturing approach, and what that might look like. With different ways we can do it. We know that amongst young people and adults, in fact, in terms of stigmatizing beliefs, they're often situated within a kind of us and them type environment and way of thinking about other people. So there are those people who have got mental illness, and then there's us, and that's why they're strange. And there's been a recent work that suggested that, particularly for young people, trying to present mental health and mental illness as being on a real continuum where everyone lies at some stage, and certainly the Mental Health Foundation have been keen to nurture that type of understanding of it, and that can help people not to see them as having mental illness and I don't, but well, we've all got mental health, or you know, can all have problems. We can all dip in and out of this. It's a continuum, and that can help people often to be more supportive, more helpful when they're confronted with those types of things. I guess partly because you see yourself as part of that as well. Mm-hmm. So it might be about how we achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. And so if there are any other questions, if you'd like to type those in, or in fact, if you have any answers for our panel in terms of the questions that they put, just in terms of sharing practice, perhaps, of what's going on in schools at the moment that you would like to share or that you found particularly successful, that's we'd love to hear those as well.
Yeah, it'd be useful to know if you know, people's experiences with young people when they've perhaps engaged in that kind of talk, when they've presented these ideas to them and they've talked in ways that suggest they are experiencing stigma from other people, or that they're self-stigmatizing themselves. But you know, it'd be nice to get a sense of how often that actually comes up. Mm. What I was going to say was that we prepared just a wee slide with kind of accessible reading that people could follow up on if they want to, and some of those are helpful. We hope that people find it helpful. Will you send out a copy of the slides to everyone, or is there another way to share that? Or
yeah, so what I'll do, well, once we've edited the video and we upload it to the website, then I can issue the link to those resources, and I tend to put the two things together so that you have the webinar video and the reading that goes with it. But that would be really helpful to share.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And we'd really welcome any contact from anyone who's been part of the webinar today. If they want to follow up on anything or ask for our help or advice with anything they're doing in this area, we'd really welcome that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, well, thank you very much to our guest presenters this afternoon. So Simon, Rebecca, Rachel and Sophia, thank you very much for sharing your time, your expertise, your energy and your enthusiasm with us. It's been much appreciated. A very successful webinar 5 in our Shine series. So as ever, as we've said, the webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Shine website within the week, and will include those resources as mentioned by Simon there. Okay, so without further ado, we will say goodbye for now. Thank you for joining us, and we will hopefully see you again for webinar 6 next term. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.